The Detroit Lions kick off their very first preseason game tomorrow, and I got one player at every position that you need to be focused on. What's going on, Lions fans? Welcome to the Pride of Detroit YouTube channel. I'm Miko, and in today's video, we're going to break down a couple players that I think you need to have your eye on as the Lions kick off their first preseason game against the New York Giants tomorrow. Now, it's worth keeping in mind that while these are technically football games, these games are served as a good evaluator for the coaching staff, and if you're a fan that's actually into evaluating players for you as well, so you can kind of gauge who has the best chance of making this roster, who's progressing, and maybe who's not necessarily showing up on the field. We've been covering a lot of these players throughout training camp observations on this channel, so definitely feel free to check back on any of those videos in the event that there's somebody on this list that you just haven't heard a ton about, or if there's somebody on this list that's actually missing that you were hoping to hear about. And before I jump into my list, let's keep one thing in mind as well. I'm not going to try to hit on all of the players or the top player at every position. These players that I'm going to list off are players that I know I'm personally going to have my eyes on. And so your list might be a little different, but definitely feel free to let me know what players you're going to have in mind in the comment section below. So, without a further ado, let's get started with the list. So, the first position we have to start with is the quarterback position. And this is pretty much a no brainer. If there's a quarterback that you need to have your eyes on, it's Nate Sudfeld. Sudfeld came onto the Lions roster last year as a late signing after training camp, and we never really got to see him hit the field, and that was primarily because Jared Goff stayed healthy. Well, so far throughout training camp, Sudfeld has been a little up and down. He started out really well early on in training camp, but the last few practices, especially against the New York Giants, he's kind of teetered a bit ever since the news of Teddy Bridgewater being signed. Well, if Sudfeld is hoping to keep a good hold of that QB2 spot, or at least give the Lions a reason to consider keeping three quarterbacks on this roster, he's going to need to start having really good performances in these preseason games. So for that reason, he's one of the first players that I'm going to have my eyes on once the Lions hit the field. It's also worth keeping in mind he's more than likely going to play the entire first half, while Adrian Martinez may get most of the second half work. Now, on to the running back position. And I know many people are probably expecting me to go Jameer Gibbs here, but I'm actually going to go in a different direction. We've talked about Jameer Gibbs quite a bit during our training camp observations. And so once we kind of go into the preseason games, while I will be excited to see what Gibbs does in his limited touches, one running back that I'm even more inclined to see and understand how he's performing at this point is Mohamed Ibrahim. Now, Ibrahim is somebody that's further down the depth chart and someone who's probably fighting for that RB4 or RB3 spot at this current moment, especially with Justin Jackson recently retiring. But there hasn't been a ton of news about him coming out of practice. Now, he did have a number of good runs during the Lions' last joint practice with the Giants. So, if he can carry that momentum into the preseason game, that may be enough to help him strengthen his case for being that third or potentially even fourth running back if the Lions decide to carry that many. Next, we got to get to the wide receivers. And this one, again, is more of a layup. I'm sure I would love to go in a number of different directions. I would love to say Dylan Drummond, who's been having a good couple days over at practice. I would love to say Denzel Mims, who's the wide receiver that the Lions traded for once training camp kind of kicked off. But we all know who the spotlight is going to be on once this preseason game kicks off, and that's Jamison Williams. Listen, JMO has been the center of the media's attention since this offseason and basically since his suspension kind of came out. And once this first preseason game kicks off, it's not going to be any different. All eyes are going to be on JMO. And while I don't believe he necessarily needs to have this big coming out party or take every reception that he gets to the house, but him putting together a good performance could be enough to put that other side of the fan base that's really harping on him in check a little bit so that they don't have as much to say. Dan Campbell's already come out and said that JMO's going to get a heavy dose of snaps once the preseason kicks off. So expect to see a lot of him primarily in the first half. I don't expect to see him a ton in the second, but who knows until we kind of get to the game. Now, onto the tight end position. And once again, I'm sure people are expecting me to say Sam Laporta here, but we've talked about Sam quite a bit throughout training camp. And for the most part, I think we all kind of know Sam's that guy, and he's been performing at a fairly high level. And I do think he's going to have his moments in the preseason game. But another tight end that I'm going to be even more focused on is James Mitchell. Now, James Mitchell is in a similar boat as Jamison Williams in that both players came into the last season with injuries and we didn't get to see them until they were further into the season. And even when we did finally get to see them, it was in a limited snap capacity. Mitchell is someone that was highly touted coming out of the draft, and if it were not for that injury, probably would have went much higher. And even when he did get his opportunities with the Lions last year, he did show a level of athleticism and playmaking ability that you really like to see out of your tight end position. So while Sam Laporta is definitely going to be the focal point for a lot of people, let's not forget about James Mitchell as this game kicks off. Now, when looking at the offensive tackle position, the player that I'm going to have my eyes on the most is Obina Eze. Now, if you guys remember, Eze was on the roster last year during Hard Knocks and kind of struggled a bit as far as taking to the position after only playing football for a very short amount of time prior to landing at TCU. And while Eze didn't make the final 53, the Lions did keep him on the practice squad, and he's been back so far throughout training camp. And there's been a little updates here and there that he's actually looked a lot better in camp compared to where he was last year. So getting him into these preseason games and hopefully working with the Sega team may be a really good first look at how much he's improved and if he possibly has a chance of being that depth piece behind the likes of Taylor Decker or Panay Sewell if one of them were potentially to suffer an injury of some kind. Next, onto the offensive guard position, I gotta go with Colby Sorsdal. Now, Sorsdal was the Lions' sixth-round pick in this year's draft, and while he's making that transition from right tackle to right guard, and so with that in mind, he's someone that I'm going to be focused on, especially when the Lions start running the ball. Sorsdal definitely showcased much stronger ability in run blocking during his time at William and Mary University than he did necessarily in pass setting. So once the Lions start employing their run game, especially if he's blocking for Muhammad Ibrahim, it's going to be interesting to see how much push Sorsdal gets and if he showcases the type of ability that makes you feel like, you know what, this guy could make the roster as a backup guard to Vitae or Glasgow. And then let's move on to the center position. Now, the center position, it's kind of tough to understand what the Lions might do here because they do have Graham Glasgow. And if Graham doesn't win the starting guard position, there's a good possibility that he could still make the roster as the backup center. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to go with Ross Pierschbacher. Pierschbacher is someone who was repping at center throughout most of OTAs and minicamp early this offseason. And with Evan Brown no longer being on the roster, the Lions could really use a good depth piece at center in the event that Frank Ragnow ends up needing to miss time due to that foot injury. Again, Pierschbacher may still have to worry about Glasgow getting that backup center spot if he doesn't win the right guard spot over Vitae. But for the sake of this game, though, he's someone I'm going to have my eye on just to see how he gels with this offensive line and if he potentially stands out in a good way. Now, looking at the defensive end spot, I had a lot of options to choose from, but I decided to go with a guy that I've been really locked in on since training camp has started, and that's Josh Paschal. Paschal is someone that the Lions drafted last year who dealt with injury and missed most of training camp and a good chunk of the season before he was finally able to join the team, where once he was in the lineup, did make his fair share of plays here and there. But now that Pascal's healthy, reports are coming out of camp that he's looked much better both in defending the run and rushing the passer. So going into this game against the Giants, I'm really interested to see if both of those things show up and if he kind of can regain the momentum that he had when he was a second round pick for the Lions last year. Speaking of former second round picks, when looking at the defensive tackle spot, I decided to go with Levi Onwuzurike over the likes of Broderick Martin. And don't get me wrong, I'm definitely going to be tuned into Broderick Martin and how he performs in this preseason game. But looking at the odds that were stacked up against Levi before heading into training camp, I can't help but be more focused on him when he has his opportunities because let's just face it, the things that Levi has had to go through to get to this point is a really good story. And if Levi can find the same type of athletic ability and playmaking ability that got him drafted in the second round 2 years ago, it's going to be something that is not only good for him, but that could be very beneficial for the Lions defense going forward. Next on the list, I had to look at the Sam linebacker position. And because the Lions are going to be using the Sam linebacker position in a number of different ways, I felt like it was necessary to include on this list. And so it should be no surprise that the player that is going to have everybody's attention when he's on the field defensively is going to be James Houston. Now, James Houston was the surprise player that came onto the scene last year that nobody expected. But once he arrived on the scene, all he did was make plays and terrorize quarterbacks. However, so far throughout training camp, the reports that have been coming out is that he's been mostly repping with the second and third team. And Dan Campbell, when asked about James Houston, basically reiterated a similar message that he said when talking about Julian Okwara, when basically saying that, like, hey, the thing with James is that he just needs to be consistent and show that he can evolve his pass rushing ability while also being able to still defend the run and defending coverage. Houston and Okwara are both battling it out for that backup Sam linebacker position behind Charles Harris. And this first preseason game could be a really good way for Houston to separate himself in a big way from Julian. Again, they're both probably going to get their opportunities, probably both in different halves of the football game. And if whichever player stands out the most is probably going to have a leg up in this camp battle. Now, onto the linebacker position. And instead of breaking this up between Mike and Will, I'm just going to say one linebacker that I'm going to have my eyes on outside of James Houston, and that's going to be Jack Campbell. Jack Campbell, being the 18th overall pick in this most recent draft, is someone that I've been expecting to kind of really pop off throughout camp. And while he's had his moments and is definitely not disappointing in any manner, he's still not quite repping consistently with the first team. He's definitely getting sprinkled in here and there, but Derek Barnes seems to have a strong hold of that starting position as of right now. So, Jack being able to showcase a strong performance in this preseason game could be enough to help give the Lions coaching staff an idea or the thought that, like, you know what, we need to give him more snaps in this upcoming week of practice. Now, moving on to the cornerback position, and again, for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to break this into nickel and outside corner. I'm just going to say one corner. And no, it's not going to be Brian Branch. I've talked enough about Brian Branch to this point. You guys know my eyes will be glued onto the screen anytime Brian Branch is on the field. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity to highlight another cornerback that's been performing fairly well in camp, but that we haven't heard a ton about to this point. And that corner being Stephen Gilmore. Now, Gilmore had a really good practice a week ago where he was able to get an interception and force a fumble and get a couple PBUs. But since then, not as much has been said about him to this point. Starling Thomas is the UDFA cornerback that a lot of people tend to talk about when we're talking about corners who have a really good shot at making this roster. But Stephen Gilmore is still someone that had the coaching staff's attention, and I would like to believe that they still have their eye on him as someone who could potentially still make this roster. So, how he performs in these preseason games starting tomorrow with the Giants could go a long way to at least shortening the gap between him and Starling Thomas, or even potentially putting him up over Thomas at this point. All right, guys, we're almost at the finish line, and I got only two more players left. So, let's start with the safety position. And at the safety position, there's really only one name to really consider at this point, and that's Ifatu Melifonwu. Now, I've been a fan of Iffy since he got drafted. With his size and his athleticism, I was really excited about the potential of him developing into a really good corner. Well, last year the Lions decided to switch him over to safety, and due to some injuries and just having a tough learning curve, things didn't quite take off the way we all thought they would for Iffy, or at least not the way he thought they would. However, things have been a slightly different story going into this year's training camp. Iffy has been continuously considered as the third safety behind both Tracy Walker and Kirby Joseph, if you're not factoring in CJ Gardner Johnson as well. But when they're typically going to that second team of safeties, Iffy is usually the first name up, teaming up with Tracy Walker. At this point, it's hard for me to imagine that Iffy's roster spot is in danger, but these types of preseason games are a really good opportunity for him to showcase his growth. Now, last but not least, we got to talk about the specialists. And at this point, I know the Lions really only have one punter and one long snapper on the team, so both of those are basically out. The only real specialist battle that's even worth considering is the kicker battle. And between Riley Patterson and Parker Romo, I'm a little more excited to see Parker Romo. And that's no shade at Riley Patterson. It's just we've seen Riley kick here before. And I expect Riley to have a really good performance in tomorrow's game when he's given his opportunities to kick. But Parker Romo, coming from the XFL, is going to have a lot to prove and be able to showcase that not only does he have a big leg, but that he can still be accurate in the NFL. So if he can take advantage of his opportunities to kick in tomorrow's preseason game, and I'm hoping that we at least get some kicking opportunities for both guys, he may really have an opportunity to impress this coaching staff as training camp continues to go along. So, guys, there you go. A player at every position that you should have your eyes on once tomorrow's preseason game kicks off. Again, if you have a couple guys that you also are going to have your eyes focused on, let me know in the comment section below and we can definitely have a discussion about it. Also, if you're looking for more information or more coverage on the Detroit Lions, be sure to head over to prideofdetroit.com where we have new articles going up all the time. Also, if you're new to this channel, be sure to hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Both of those things really help out this channel and it'll help you out. So the next time we upload a video, you'll know right away. So once again, everybody, I'm Miko here with Pride of Detroit. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.